Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for another episode of Dreams to Realty Property Insights. And on today's show, we're going to be discussing a very important factor, especially in today's market in Australia, purchasing with equity. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a lot going on and some changes, especially from this time last year. So we're going to be discussing things like land to asset ratio, the CoreLogic Home Value Index, the Great Property Mismatch. Now, these are big terms that probably get thrown around a lot, and you've maybe had a few question marks over your head going, I wonder what that means. Well, that's why we have this podcast where we can bring in experts like Susan, the Managing Director at Cala Property, who works with these terms every day in her business, and she will help to give us a little bit of a better understanding about what it means and how it impacts purchasing property. So before we get started, a quick economic overview. So in a snapshot, we've got inflation in Australia sitting at about 7%. We've also got the RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia's cash rate at about 3.85%. Will they raise it to 4% when they next meet in a couple of weeks? I wonder. That's the question probably on everyone's minds at the moment. We've also seen some impressive wage growth to meet these high inflation levels. We've seen wages growth of close to, I think, 3.7% in the last quarter. This compares to December quarter of a rise of 2.5%. So slowly it's rising, but does it really cover the costs that we are experiencing? And I guess Susan's insight will help us understand a little bit more about that, because we've also seen the rental prices continue to rise. And could that be because mum and dad investors are needing to hitch up the rentals in order to just maintain the everyday costs of living, and also perhaps to get into further investments as we see the prices the values of houses rising. So let's bring Susan to the stage now and discuss a few of these interesting headlines we've been noticing over the last couple of weeks. Susan, I'm just going to invite you up to the stage. Something's happening. I think we have Susan finally.
Hello. How are you, Sage?
Thank you so much for joining us. I am actually doing well today. Yeah.
My pleasure. Good to be back.
Yes, well, it's been an interesting 2 weeks as I've noticed some headlines popping up, Susan, and I know if anyone was listening last time we met, we were talking about the headlines and how they can be skewed to try and instigate some sort of response from the viewers. Peter Dutton says house prices could increase by 50% in the next 10 years. Would-be buyers being urged to get in now or miss out. And Adelaide's median house price could reach $900,000. Susan, any insight on these types of headlines that might be popping up?
This is a very interesting comment from Peter Dutton. I'm not quite sure what sort of data he might be referring to, given that historically for the past 25 years, house prices have increased 6.8% compound interest year on year. So 50% in 10 years, I think, is highly unlikely. So look, I think that I think possibly what Peter Dutton is referring to, or where that influence of that comment is coming from, is from his time as immigration minister, with 200,000 new immigrants coming to the country. And given how tight the housing market is at the moment, and there's a real it's already a very tight market. There's already not enough new land being released. There's not enough builders to build the properties. There aren't enough subcontractors to help with the building of the properties, or civil workers or engineers or council workers. Everywhere across the board there is a shortage, and not just in my industry. I think in lots of industries have been impacted, whether it's IT or health or whatever. So I think that there is a real concern about these new migrants, about where they're going to live. And last week we touched on the Cala Air products that I have developed, which is, just a quick recap, is leveraging the algorithms of Airbnb, stays, bookings.com, etc. And we're actually finding that a lot of new migrants are staying in Airbnbs for a couple of months while they're waiting to try to find their own property. So that's interesting. That didn't used to be what happened. You know, people didn't stay in hotels, but you know, that's just the reality of the market. And I think, given it is a more expensive rental market, that's not really feasible for, you know, your ordinary Australian, like you mentioned. In terms of Adelaide's median house price, yeah, Adelaide's experienced some good growth, and there's you know, some very strong economic indicators and immigration indicators. The average price of 900, yeah, that's I think probably more possible. I think the average price at the moment in Adelaide would be around 600, but we're starting to see luxury properties skew that data a little bit. Although if you do the proper research statistics, you kind of take out the outliers, right? So we would probably be looking, if I was going to be researching that market, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And I would take out the luxury market to try to get an idea of what you call your mum and dad investors. What are people likely to going to need? But Adelaide has certainly enjoyed more growth than it has for a long time. And for the first time in a very long time, I can't quite remember, don't have the statistics quite off the top of my head, but in the last couple of years, it's experienced positive net interstate migration for a very long time. And we're starting to see quite strong migratory patterns with Australians coming from both Darwin and Melbourne back to Adelaide. Often they originated from Adelaide and their parents are aging, or their kids are getting to that high school age and they want them to go to the schools that, you know, and have all of that infrastructure and the kind of things that high school kids want. So there's certainly some truth to that, I would say. But, you know, in terms of equity and using equity, there's a huge amount of dormant equity as well lying around in Australia. And I think it's part of the reason why, you know, we're not going to have this huge, you know, fixed rate cliff that, you know, people like to talk about, that there's just no evidence whatsoever. There has not been any uptick in defaults. You know, what's interesting when people look at, say, mortgages, they often just look at it from the burden of paying the mortgage. But when you look at it from when you first applied to get the mortgage, the bank has actually already de-risked that for you. So firstly, in terms of what is allowable income, right? So you have two constraints when it comes to borrowing money. The first is the deposit amount, and that's the deposit that the banks require, not what the builder requires, okay? So the banks require, say, 10% or 20%. If it's below, if it's below 20%, so if the LVR is 80% or higher, then, or 81% or higher, then you will be subject to lender's mortgage insurance, right? So you've already got 20% skin in the game, okay? So if you've got a few issues after you've been paying your loan for a while, then you can ring the bank and say, look, can I just go on a hardship clause for 6 months? Or let me just have a bit of or can I revert to interest only while I just kind of get through the next, you know, whatever's going on for you in your life. But also they look at the property. You know, if the property is in an A-grade property in an A-grade location, then they won't lend 80%. They might lend 70%. If it's a self-managed super fund, they'll lend 70%, very rarely 80%. And if it's an income-producing cattle station out in Whoop Whoop, you might be lucky to get 40 or 50%, because the way the bank is looking at it is, if you do default, how quickly will it be for them to relieve the burden off their balance sheet? Right? They're not interested in making a profit. They just do not want the debt on their balance sheet, because that will affect their credit score. Okay, so banks have credit scores as well when they're dealing with other institutions. So they also de-risk it in terms of what's deemed allowable income. So your salary is counted at 100% of your salary, but unless your bonuses and commissions are highly predictable and have been for a long time, they might discount that a little bit or take an average over the last 5 years. Also, things like overseas income or rental income, they'll discount that somewhat as well. So there are lots of ways that the bank has already discounted your borrowing capacity. Another way is in the assessment rate. So the assessment rate is higher than what the retail rate is, in case there's movement in the markets. So for that reason, there is not a huge amount of default, but also we're very good at paying our mortgages, right? We like to own our own homes outright. And a common investment strategy with high positive cash flow property is to actually pay down your principal place of residence faster. And that leads you to having a huge amount of dormant equity that you could potentially leverage to invest in property.
Wow, thanks, Susan. That's given us some insight on, I guess, equity, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So this time last year, I think we saw the value of properties decrease significantly, close to, went down -9% or something like that, according to CoreLogic data. And I think recently we've seen 2 consecutive months of very small rises in the value of properties according to CoreLogic's Home Value Index. Now, Susan, do you think that we are currently moving into a hot market, from your opinion? And can you differentiate between a buyer's and a seller's market, please?
Absolutely. It's actually super simple. People often say, oh, it's so hard to predict, where you're at in the market. It's actually really not. It's highly predictable. And there is a very clear correlation between your ability to get money and your ability to buy property, right? So the way the brakes get put on the market is the market outpaces itself. So just basic supply and demand where people can't afford, people aren't prepared to pay. And look, I remember probably about 6 years ago would have been, maybe 7 years ago, would have been the first time that we started to see a lot of rent investors come into the market. And that hadn't really existed too much as a cohort prior. It was an anomaly. People wanted to first buy their own home before they thought about investing. Now, what rent investors do is that they're typically in expensive property markets like Sydney. They rent where they want to live, so they can rent for, let's say, $1,000 for a 3-bedroom apartment in Bondi. But that same 3-bedroom apartment might cost $3 to $5 million, right, depending on the location and the quality of the property. So, but they're not prepared to have a loan for $3 to $5 million. They're just like, no, even if I could get that lending, which a lot of my clients could, they're not going to do that. They would rather use that, say, let's call it 2 million, right? Because it's not always that elevated. But let's say I've got lots of clients that are in that position where they make the decision, okay, what can I do with $2 million? Now, the very big difference between what Cala Property does and what pretty much any other company does is that the property is the last piece of the puzzle. We start with the finance, we start with the structure and the strategic goals of each and every client. And there is so varied from, the obvious ones are tax minimization, retirement insecurity, ability to retire or semi-retire sooner. But they can be very nuanced, from wanting to send my kids to a really good school, wanting to bring my mum over here from Thailand because she's getting older and, want to be able to look after her. Suddenly dealing with the disabled child who's very high care and someone then has lost their ability to work at the same capacity that they did before. Other people want a holiday home, even though that's not necessarily the best investment. They come to me because they still understand that it needs to have the same investment fundamentals. And even though I only deal with investors, sometimes I get first home buyers because they know that they're only going to be in that home for a couple of years and then it needs to stack up as investment property. So very varied in that, right? So, when it comes to rent vesting, what people were looking at is, well, do I want to spend all of that money getting a massive mortgage, or do I actually want to just rent where I want to live and invest elsewhere? So what we do then is we look at that amount of money and that they have, their budget, and go, right, well, where is the right time to invest? Now that's when we bring into account, the percentages of growth and decline that allow us to map different cities, capital cities or regions, which is the macro research that we do on that property clock. And a lot of people are familiar with the property clock. It's not actually just a property clock, it's an asset clock. It can be used for shares, it can be used for foreign exchange, it can be used for a whole lot of other different assets. So basically what we see is that when property is getting too expensive for people who want to live in that area to buy, and they go down, say, that rent vesting strategy, they then look at the market often self-corrects, right? But the other thing that can happen is that, like what's happened recently with inflation, is when the RBA kicks in higher interest rates, that takes the heat out of the market because suddenly people can't borrow as much money. So it can be two things. It can be the price of the market and it can be your ability to borrow money. But they both lead to the same event, which is a decline in the market. Now, what we saw, so when you asked me about it being a heated market, no, what I think you have noticed or observed in the market is two consecutive price rises, or core value rises. But that, I would suggest, is a direct influence from the directly linked to the RBA holding the interest rates for just that 1 month. And I think because of the amount of liquidity in the market, which is very different to where we were in the GFC, there are a lot of people there with a lot of money just going, okay, as soon as that market shows any sign of, holding, then that's a good time to jump. And that's what we've seen. Plus, the other thing that we see is that when we're in that bottom, like that second quarter of the property clock, so just very quickly, you've got the peak of the market and the bottom of the market, and the market declines into a correction phase, then it goes into a declining phase, then the recovery, and then the growth market, right? So the recovery phase is the right time to invest. The growth market is when you make the most amount of money out of property. The correction phase is where prices are correcting, but price and supply and demand have pretty much corrected at, say, 3 o'clock. But between 3 and 6, the market declines further because people have lost confidence in the property market. Now, what we saw is that with that one little bit of hold, everyone sort of flooded back into the market. But also, there's in that declining phase, a lot of people don't put their properties on the market, and that can skew the auction clearance rates data a little bit. So at the moment, it looks like auction clearance rates are at a big high, like around are they pushing towards 80% of some of the headlines that I've been looking at after mid to high 70s around Australia. I think that a lot of that data is maybe not as pure as I would like to see because there is less property on the market. So while you may have less people looking for it, this is a highly liquid market still with a lot of underutilized equity, right? Because people took advantage of those low interest rates to keep paying the amount that they had been paying in a high interest rate environment. They just kept that going. But of course, that paid down their home loan a lot faster. So it's a lot. There are a lot of variables that go into it, but it's actually quite straightforward. So is this a hot market? No, very, very far from it. And for that reason, I think that the RBA is very unlikely to hold interest rates again, much less decline them for a while. They want to get inflation under control much faster.
And I think their target is around 2 to 3%. That's where they need to get it. Timing the market, how can you really time a market? Isn't that where people like yourself who have businesses that help people create profiles, investor profiles of what they're, where they analyze their goals deeply and significantly based on data, I think, isn't that more important what your goals are rather than timing the market? Do you have anything to add on that before we move on?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the most critical part, right? You start with what your goals are. What are you trying to achieve? Then what is your budget and what is your structure? Are you investing inside or outside of super? What is the LVR, interest only, principal and interest? But it's not just one market, right? There are lots of different markets. So, talking about that headline around Adelaide, that would suggest that that's bucking the trend of the 9% CoreLogic housing price index, right? And that's true, right? That's an Australia-wide assumption. But Australia are on, like, different capital cities and regions are on different markets. At the moment, I'm actually in Yeppoon in central Queensland, and this market has grown 7.3% in the last 12 months. Okay, so that's not a 9% decrease, is it? So, that's where my clients come to me and go, okay, we've got $800,000 to invest. What would you recommend? They're not saying to me, I want to buy a house in Brisbane, right? I'm not a buyer's agent. Okay, that's not what I do. Okay, I deal with property as an asset class, but the research is what underpins the recommendations for the property. But the property is actually the very last piece of the puzzle.
Thanks for that. So I think we've also noticed some economic growth. Currently after the budget that was released earlier in the month, I think we're in some sort of we have got a surplus in funds nationally. However, we're expecting a huge deficit next year, and economic growth next year is going to decrease. How do these things sort of impact the overall housing market and land valuations? Is it mainly just supply and demand that is impacting the value of land? And how does it correlate with rental prices from your experience, please?
Okay, there are a lot of variables in that question. Okay, so the economy. Okay, look, that's probably a much bigger piece, but let's just go to the land value side of things, right? So land values, yeah, look, supply and demand is a big part of it, and then again, people's ability to, get access to finance. I mean, I remember reading this meme years ago: if travel was free, you'd never see me again. And it's the same with property, right? If property costs $1, everyone would go and buy 10 houses, right? So, property doesn't cost $1. So we've got to look at what we can afford, when we can afford it, and what is the purpose. So I often say to my clients, like, sometimes I'll show my clients the property for investment and they'll go, oh, that's a really nice property, maybe we can live there. And I go, well, yeah, you probably can live there, but is that actually what you're trying to achieve? When it comes to your home, I always say to my clients, buy what you can afford, where you want to live, when you can afford it, right? And then work out the rest later, because you're going to live there. You can work on it. You'll, as you earn more money, you'll do things to it. You might renovate the kitchen in 5 years, or paint on the weekends, or do a nice garden, right? That's a very different scenario to the numbers. When I'm trying to get people to understand the difference between a property to live in as opposed to an investment property, I always say cash flows, not kitchens, right? So it's always important to have nice properties and good quality properties, and our properties have beautiful kitchens, but that's not the point. The point is that the cash flow stacks up. The kitchens are nice because it does have an effect on the cash flow, actually, and that's part of the reason why we negotiate with our builders to have what we call a level of colour property inclusions, and that makes the property stand out from everything else in the market, as well as be a much more design forward property and durable property, so that our clients don't have to spend a single cent for at least the first 10 years. And that's certainly played out with our clients. So coming back to land supply and demand, part of the reason why the Sunshine Coast, for example, has gone through the roof in the last few years. We were recommending the Sunshine Coast about 6 or 7 years ago, 2017, 2018. And And that was because of the research that we could see, right? They were building a $1.8 billion teaching hospital, which is the largest in the Southern Hemisphere, upgrading the airport from domestic to international, putting in a submarine cable that connected us with the rest of Asia, broadband submarine cable that has a huge effect on productivity. But one of the other, heaps and heaps of infrastructure, right? So that's what you need to start with when you're looking at where is a good place to invest, and understanding really the multiplier effect and the value of that to that local regional economy. But what I really saw was that they were running out of land. There's a lot of national parks and state protected land, and there was very little land that was able to be developed. So it was like, well, once Stocklands is finished in Aura and Palmview, there's nothing left, right? There's really nothing left. So other than going up, which is starting to happen around the new Sun City, which was Australia's only greenfield CBD at the time, and that's going to accommodate some of the Olympic team actually when they come over for the events that are around the Sunshine Coast. So yeah, they're going up. Like when we first started looking at the Sunshine Coast, you'd be lucky to find an apartment block that was over maybe 6 floors or 8 floors, and now they're huge, right? And it's not going to be exactly like the Gold Coast in terms of height, I don't think, but it's certainly more in line with what maybe you'd see around, Bondi or Hamilton in Brisbane or South Bank in Melbourne. Maybe not quite as big as South Bank, but yeah, St Kilda maybe, yeah.
Well, that sounds really exciting. I think I've been close to the Sunshine Coast. I've been to Fraser Island, and it's really beautiful around there. It's humid, but yeah.
Well, Fraser Coast is an area that's taking off as well, right? And going back to the economic input, right? So, and this actually is important for the economy, right? So when we spend a lot of money on infrastructure, the point is to have an economic output. And I think that's the balance is, where do you invest and how long does it take for you to get that output? And also, do we ever really see that? Like when we're looking at infrastructure like roads and bridges and so forth, what real economic impact does it have, other than potentially privatizing roads and tolls and all of that stuff long term? But when you look at, say, building a hospital, that has a huge economic impact, right? Because it not only for employment that builds the property, but then also stays in it. So I often say with roads and bridges, the jobs that are created are jobs that will leave, right? Because no one's required to operate the road or the bridge really, other than maintenance, over time. But, the crews that build the hospitals are different to the people who will then operate the hospitals, and the hospitals need high operation a lot, right? So there's a huge economic influence that go beyond jobs. So, but also hospitals and schools and universities, less so schools, but hospitals and universities, they tend to come with their own economies where, if you're thinking about what you need for a hospital, you also need places where people can eat, people can stay short term and potentially long term. You need retail, you need entertainment. If you've, I've spent quite a lot of time around hospitals in the last 2 years, and there are hours and hours where you can't do anything. And so it's like, oh, well, let's go for a walk. And then you'll go to the pub, or then you'll go and see a movie, or go shopping, or you're hungry and you're so sick of hospital food. So even though they've got amazing cafeterias, it's like, let's go get some Thai or some Indian, or it's really late at night and you can't even be bothered cooking. So you'll just grab something on the way home. So there are all those kinds of things that you, florists and post office and newsagents, people who work in the hospitals work very long and often antisocial hours. So they need a lot of that day-to-day stuff within the hospital. Universities operate the same way. So they can have travel centres and banks and all kinds of stuff, health food stores and cafes and shopping and food co-ops and art centres and galleries and, a whole lot of stuff. So that's the kind of stuff that has a broader economic impact. But certainly when it comes to land values, it's basic supply and demand economics, as well as what people value at the time. We really saw this during COVID, right? And we probably saw it when, Sigrid Thornton was on Sea Change on the ABC back in the, late 80s, early 90s. People started to suddenly go, oh, well, maybe that small town, not a bad idea. I mean, it was pretty funny small town. But certainly as technology has enabled us to have different work patterns outside of an office environment, we have been able to create our own work environments away from the office. So that has led to that sea change, tree change. But in actual fact, it's an e-change, right? So that's one of my terms, is an e-change. It's actually been technology that's pushed it. A lot of people say that it's COVID, it's the COVID-induced change to the coastal suburbs, etc. But it's actually not. It's been coming for a long time. It's the net immigration or net migratory trends away from Sydney and Melbourne have been coming for strong for about 10 to 15 years. They have ramped up because a lot of these bigger companies with work from home policies were slated to be able to be launched in about 10 years, 3 years ago. And they had to suddenly create these securities and environments within about 6 weeks. And they did. They managed that really well. And now the struggle is to get people to come back because people are quite happy there. But that has changed the way we're able to live and therefore where we want to live. So Noosa and Byron Bay, right, are two of the best performing markets in Australia in the last 5 years, but certainly during COVID. Why not? If you can, why wouldn't you live there? And if you got in at a time where it wasn't prohibitively expensive, then that makes sense. And now people are bleeding away from that. That ripple effect is very vast. We normally talk about the ripple effect in cities where the cool place becomes too expensive. So then the daggy place next door becomes gentrified and cool, right? So in Sydney, for example, you can look at, say, this is going in more recent terms. If you go a long way back, then these were like dingy kind of working areas. But looking at, say, Paddington, which became incredibly expensive, and then that kind of bleeding into Darlinghurst and Surrey Hills and now Redfern, right? And so 10 years or probably 15 years ago, no one would live in Redfern. So, it's a scary part of town, but now it's all really pretty and lots of lovely cafes and art galleries, and it's cool. So, but what we're seeing along the coast is that I've, been walking along the beach in Yeppoon and talked to people, and they've come from the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast because it's too hectic there now. They don't like the lifestyle there anymore. They want that quieter lifestyle, which is what they used to have. So the value of land is also related to our values, where we want to live.
Thanks for that, Susan. I think it's really interesting to notice the difference in prices between the increase of houses over the last, say, 25 years and the increase of units over the last 25 years to work out how our values have kind of changed. I think houses and units, they've increased by roughly the same. I think people are wanting the houses and the units just as much as each other. Looking at some data I've got here, house values over the past 25 years have increased in Sydney by 7.6%, and the apartments have increased by 6.3%. So does that mean people are moving more towards the houses, do you think, in Sydney?
Nationally, it's 6.8% for houses and 5.9% for apartments. And there's a lot of people who feel like, houses get the growth and apartments get the cash flow. And there is a bit of truth to that. In my anecdotal experience, if you don't extrapolate as far out as 25 years, I have noticed that the fastest growth, which is really important when you're trying to get that quick equity. So when you're trying to build a property portfolio, okay, and this relates going back to that property clock, right? So what you want is to find property that is in, say, that 7 o'clock, 7, 8 o'clock on the recovery cycle, right? So get a property there, invest in, if you don't have a lot of cash, invest in house and land, go through the motions of building house and land in a high growth area, right? Then that's the type of property that's going to give you that fast equity lift. And then you're able to leverage that equity growth to invest in the second property. Now, at the moment, with interest rates a lot higher, that's part of why I've developed the Cala Air model, is because you get that high cash flow first. So what I'm actually recommending to clients is to get into the Cala Air model first, and then go to the house and land build, and then potentially another cash flow property, and then house and land. And that's enough actually to set people up really well for retirement, even if they start at the age of 40 or 45, right? So, or even 50, you only need about 10 years to develop that strategy pretty quickly. So that's where I help a huge amount of Australians to feel safe and secure in retirement, which is really what I'm kind of doing this for. But yeah, it's interesting, what we noticed in about 2 years ago, the difference between, in Sydney, the difference between the average price of a house and the average price of an apartment got up to $1 million, right? Now that is massive. $1 million makes you think about things in a different way, okay? So a 3-bedroom house or a 3-bedroom apartment, if you're going to save $1 million, maybe an apartment's not a bad idea after all, right? So, and that's where a lot of people have gone to. And I think too, in terms of lifestyle and what we value, we love this idea of having a big block of land, etc. But we don't have 4 kids that are playing in the background anymore, or neighbours' kids. They're in the rumpus room on games, right? We don't have the badminton thing set up in the backyard, or that tennis ball that used to smack around on the pole, or kick around a ball, play frisbee, all the things that we used to do in the backyard. And, we don't like the maintenance either. I think we're so busy that the thought of having Saturdays where we're dealing with house maintenance is not appealing to anyone anymore. And that is something that people like about apartments. So, and apartments often have a huge amount of amenity, like the Cala Air properties that we're doing at the moment. The amenities are extraordinary inside these buildings. So you're having swimming pools and gyms and things that, you don't have to maintain. You don't have to really think about. It's, saunas, virtual golf rooms, cinemas, like all kinds of stuff, and really great open spaces, views for miles, being able to book out, your own private dining room, having a tech person on site for all those people who work from home, all of those kinds of things that yes, you pay for it in strata, but these strata fees are surprisingly low. They're around $5,000 a year. So a lot of people are just seeing that as a cost of living well and going, you know what, this is fine, I'm happy to do it this way. So again, this is changing the way we do things. I can't imagine most of my school friends, right, they grew up in house and land, like big house and land. But my daughter's school friends often lived in apartments, right? And that's just in that one generation.
Well, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the interest rates being held for a month there, and that caused a little bit of a rise in values, because I think a lot of people started to continue to jump into the market. Going back to more data, I seem to be throwing a lot of data around today, but going back to more data, there was, according to CoreLogic, about 13,166 investment properties purchased by Australians in March of 2023, and I think that's when the interest rates got held. But it's also interesting to think about the build to rent. I think you mentioned that was a strategy that people were using, especially when there was a tax incentive to do so. That's decreased quite a lot, 15%. It's gone down 15% compared to what it was at 30%. But in regards to the immigrants coming in over the next few years, the Housing Accord in Australia is going to be setting a goal to build or create 1 million new dwellings in 5 years, starting from 2024. So looking at all that data, Susan, How do you think property type will impact the equity a homeowner has? I think you said that the apartments can provide more rental yield. That's important these days, especially for the homeowners who are trying to continue to build their portfolios. And is there an A-grade type of property, according to you?
Okay, there are a lot of questions there. Firstly, the 1 million dwellings, God knows how. Like, honestly, we we don't have the workers, right? We don't have the supply. We're still struggling with getting enough supply. I don't know. I don't know where they get these numbers from. I mean, that's what they need to. I think that's the goal. That is a very lofty goal of what is potentially required just to deal with the demand that we're creating through immigration, as well as the existing demand. I mean, massive rental crisis all over Australia right now. So, anyway, it's just funny. It's just these funny, policies. I'm like, okay, I'd like to see the detail on that. A good goal to have, right? An important goal to have. Buy to rent is a different kind of strategy than, say, the Cala Air property or an investment property where you are investing in a property that will be rented. The build to rent property type is a completely different type of property, and it's been very popular in America, and that's part of the reason why it's been sort of looked at in Australia. I'm not really sure how successful that is, but basically what it is, it's not investors who are buying those properties, it's the developers who are building them. All right, so the developers building it. And I think maybe where just the reason why they've gone down, just anecdotally off, just from my experience, possibly one of the reasons it's gone down is that you've got an entire development that's full of renters. Now, we know that renters tend not to look after their properties, right? And not in the same way that homeowners do. So when we're looking at our data, one of the points of data we want to see is the ratio of families to, or not just families, but owners to renters, because if there's a high level of owners, we know that the streets are going to look really nice. There's a lot of keeping up with the Joneses type activity going on, and that makes for a lovely neighbourhood, right? And a desirable place where people drive past and go, oh, I'd like to live there. But they're not going to do that when they see, like with the apartments that are built to rent, it's so obvious to me where the renters are. Because, not just the build to rent, but in any apartment block, if you stand down at the street and you look up, the apartments that have got washing on the balcony are the renters, because it's in the bylaws that you're not allowed to do that. And the owners don't like that. They think it makes it look really messy and not very cohesive. And that's the biggest point of contention with apartments is washing on the balconies. For houses, it's the fences, right? Who's going to pay for the fence, and what kind of fence are we going to do? They're the things that are most likely in the tribunals, right? So, So what you asked something else about that as well?
Yeah, just wondering if in your opinion, is there an A-grade type of property? Because we see properties rise in a falling market. We see property values decrease in, and rising markets. So in your opinion, is there an A-grade type of
there are A-grade properties, but that's not the reasons necessarily why prices buck the trend. Sorry, properties buck the trends. That has to do with a whole lot of other data, particularly population, right? Population, jobs. Look, essentially, new jobs drive population. Population drives demand. Demand drives growth, right? The hundreds of points of data that we research is really about trying to uncover those three key areas. But it's not as simple as just looking up that one equation, unfortunately. I wish it was. But there are A-grade properties in terms of the way that banks will look at their lending. Okay, so you can borrow, depending on the lending environment, you can borrow, say, 95% with LMI on A-grade properties sometimes, right? Just depends on the lending environment. And the way I kind of get my clients to think about that is going back to what I was saying about getting properties off the balance sheet quickly if somebody defaults, a borrower defaults. Just think about the type of property that you don't even need to list it and it will sell, okay? So the properties that come to mind that are probably fairly easily accessible for everyone to understand is, say, an apartment in Bondi, right? It's bang, on the market, it's gone, right? Or a house in Balmain, or there are a million other examples. But the extreme of that, the other end of the spectrum, would be, say, a commercial property in Darlinghurst, where if you drive down Oxford Street, you've got 4 out of 5 properties that are unrented. So if somebody wants to buy one of those properties, there's already fairly clear evidence that retail is not working there. Usually, I would say that's probably from what we call the Westfield effect. When Westfield gets built, it really has a massive impact on the strip shopping in the area. And on Oxford Street used to be such a thriving, fashion area and near the markets, etc. But even down towards the city, it had all of those cool eateries. Lots of artists from COFA and designers from COFA would start their fashion labels there. Had lots of really cool stuff. And then when Westfield was built in Bondi, it pretty much decimated it. And the landlords didn't keep up either. They just kept their rents extremely high rather than worked with the tenants to keep them in the tenancy. And then Westfield opened up again in where the David Jones building is. So that's, on Pitt Street. That obviously has had a double whammy because it bookends Oxford Street. So, but there are A-grade properties as far as the bank is concerned. What we do notice is that, like I said before, those high growth areas, looking at the 9% decline in values Australia-wide, every single one of my clients in the last 12 months has made money off the properties that I've recommended to them, even if the property's not built yet. All right, so we've got a group of clients that were in the northern growth corridor of Melbourne, which is where my data identified they should go, with properties from 614,000 up to, I think the highest was 700 and even though the property is not built. I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Sorry, we lost you for a moment there. Could you just repeat what you said about the data in Melbourne showing that the properties are about?
Yeah, sure. So the areas that I recommended for clients a year ago, where they put down their deposits and getting ready to build, there's been delays in the land registration because there's been delays in everything. Excuse me. And in that 12-month period, the properties have gone up in value about 130 grand. So these are properties that were sold between 617,000 and I think 737,000. And every single one of those properties has gone up on average $130,000. So that's a huge amount of growth in any market that would be considered good growth. But that's where our research is very unique and really pinpoints the right properties, and not just the suburb, but the right street and the right lot on that street, the right aspect, the right size, and then the right house to go on that property.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. I think you mentioned convenience is a huge factor there, enabling people to get out and about easily around their house to have a lifestyle. Can a property's value also change seasonally? Its value is great in summer, but then in winter it might decrease a bit. And I've noticed there's a lot of house opens around 10 a.m. in the morning, and that's because maybe a house gets quite hot later on in the day. And could you just also point out for anyone who doesn't really know what the difference is between pricing a property and valuing a property, and how asking price is different to the offer price? That's a lot of questions again, but if you could try and unpack that.
Sure. Okay, look, traditionally, spring is the time that you put your properties on the market, right? Because the garden looks the nicest. The days are, springy, it's hopefully not dark and grey and raining, and no one's going to come out to an open or stand around for an auction. Interesting what you say about it's interesting anecdotal observation about, the heat of the property, like opens being at 10 o'clock. I'm not really sure why they are, actually. I think it's more that everyone gets out of bed and looks at the papers and goes, okay, cool, let's go look at properties. I often think about the amount of school sport that's on before 12 o'clock and think that's craziness to have it at 10 o'clock. But, if you're buying a property, I guess you're going to prioritise that. There does tend to be a trend to property sales, but I wouldn't necessarily say that's specifically seasonal value, right? I think it's more just that we tend to sell at that period of time. There tends to be quite a lot of buyer activity in regional areas around Christmas holidays because, people from Sydney and Melbourne go to Noosa or the Central Coast and, you see them looking at the real estate boards and going, oh, wow, that property is only 1.5 million, whereas in Melbourne, that's so much, you can't buy anything like that property for 1.5 million, or Melbourne or whatever. So, people go, oh, why don't we get a holiday house? And 3 years later, they realise they've never been there and they've lost money, and so they're going to sell it. So there's a lot of turnover as well in those regional areas for that reason. Now, in terms of price and value, big difference. So the valuer is valuing a property for the bank's lending, okay? This is really important that people understand this, that when you're looking at what comparable prices are in the market, you're looking at sales prices. So it's a little bit like looking at wholesale and retail, if you like. That's probably an easy way for people to imagine what, the difference. So a valuer is liable to the bank for his or her valuations. So the valuer will go in and assess the value of a property based on comparable sales in that area for the previous 6 months, right? And you'll see this on CoreLogic data. When you do a valuation report, you'll have a low to high level of confidence. So if it's a high level of confidence, that means that a property that's essentially the same type of property, the same size of property, the same level of inclusions, the same size of property has sold in the previous 6 months, and this was the value that was achieved for that. Therefore, you will get the same value, right? So that's a high level of confidence. A low level of confidence is we have no comparable sales, but based on like longer historic data or looking at projections, ish, right? It's this amount ish, but we're not really sure. Okay, so they're not happy to be very confident in their recommendation because it's about the bank then lending money to buy that property. Okay, the valuation so that's the valuation of a property from looking at like a wholesale perspective, but it's about mitigating risk for the bank. When it comes to the price of a property, it's got nothing to do with statistics and data. It's got to do with emotion, right? And so when you go to an auction, you see that in full flight, right? You see people going, you can see it in their eyes that they can imagine their children playing in the backyard, or they can see their family and friends having a barbecue or having a dinner party, or, where the pool table is going to go, all of those things, the kind of gardens that they're going to have, the pool parties, whatever it is, the neighbors, the storage, and even for rentals, you see that, you start walking in and go, oh, cool, that'll go there. And that's where I put this. And that's the emotional side of things. And that's what drives up the price of a property. And that's why it needs to, that's where you have the seasonal pricing. It's not really about the value. It's more to do with the fact that people can more easily visualize that, that garden is beautiful, and look at all the pretty flowers, and forget about the maintenance, but look at all the pretty flowers, and I can see those colors, and, that kind of thing. The grass is green, literally. So yeah, they'll pay for it.
hasn't been photoshopped by real estate agents.
Not yet.
Lush.
That's what gets them in there to the auction, but it's not what makes them bid.
Exactly right. Yeah. So some other interesting data as we move into the end of the discussion. Rental prices in capital cities have been averaging around the $570 mark, and that's close to 60% of a frontline worker like a nurse or a firefighter's pay. So that's quite a big ask, really. But then looking from the investor's perspective, that could be helping them to then enter the market into further properties. But some other data shows that close to 90% of homeowners don't ever get into that second property. And is that because they just don't understand that's how property works, that you're meant to buy more with your equity, and that's how you create that passive income for you? Any insights of that before we move on to the last?
So when you say 90% don't buy more than their first property, is that their first home or first investment?
Not exactly sure. Yeah, I think it's just the first house.
Okay, I'm not sure about that data. The data I do know is that we have 2.0, according to the ATO recent statistics, we have 2.05 million property investors in Australia, and only 71% of those buy more than one property. Okay, so what that indicates to me is that they get it wrong. Okay, and where I think they get it wrong is that they're not looking at firstly, they start with the property, not the team and not the research. Okay, the first piece is to get the right team around you, a team who you trust, of people who do the research, who understand the finance, who understand the legals. That's the team that you need to get first. And at Cala Property, we have already created that for you. We call it the Cala Concierge team. And then we do the research based on all of the markets, all the residential markets around Australia. And then based on the clients, like you've already mentioned, their specific strategic goals, their wealth creation strategy, their structure and their finance or budget, that's when we drill down through the macro, micro due diligence data, and then the micro, ultra micro research to find the right property for that client. So that's where we think people get it wrong, mostly with investment properties. Secondly, the biggest part of that research is the timing of the market, right? That's the first part. That's where you start. And if you do not understand that, you can really stuff it up, because there's this myth that you'll always make money out of property, but the reality is that you will never realize the capital growth of that property if you can't afford to hang on to that property. So if the holding costs of that property affect your lifestyle too much, then you'll need to sell it because it's causing you too much pain. So going back to property yields in capital cities, in Sydney, for example, in Sydney City, or around the what we would typically call like 0 to 30 k's from the CBD, that area, the rental yields are only between 1.5% to 3%. Now, if you're looking at interest rates of 6 or 7%, already there's a massive discrepancy, and that's without paying for council, water, property management, repairs, vacancy, so that's where you can be really at risk. And then, if you stuff it up the first time because you just didn't go into it with your eyes open, and it's really easy to do that, then it's very hard to go, oh yeah, property's a great asset class for me. That's where people go, oh, I'll just top up my super, or I'll invest in Bitcoin or something, because I'll just go, well, I don't really get this, and property's terrible, right? You hear that a lot with people who haven't got it. Because from my perspective, with all of the research that we do, it's actually relatively easy to get it right. You don't have to have the same level of research that I do, but it helps, right? That you won't get it wrong if you do, but you can certainly start with that awareness. And a lot of people don't. They just go to opens in their area and go, oh, that's nice. Someone will I'd like to live there, so somebody else will, right? But in terms of equity, yes, I think this relates back to what we were talking about before, in that, if you're not leveraging if you don't get that timing of the market right, and you've just been able to hang on to that property to get through to that next cycle, and then you've managed to pay it down and that's what you focus on, you're probably going to be a bit scared to then leverage that equity, which effectively tops up your loan again for your home, to invest again. But what we look at doing, right, the strategy that we prefer is have people have their own home, and then they first pay that down, leverage equity to get their first property. And at the moment, the Cala Air properties are the ones to go for in terms of, I mean, the net cash flow on those are between $15,000 and $45,000 a year, right? Net. Okay. So net before tax. So using that money to pay down the home loan, and then using the equity growth in the apartment or in the home loan again to go for a high equity growth property like house and land. Now, just something I forgot to say before as well about equity, about growth with the way we perceive house and land versus apartments. Apartments do have a very similar growth rate over 25 years as homes. But in my experience, they take a bit longer to get there, right? So, and I've seen apartments stay the same price for 10 years before they start to move. So that is not a good idea for a growth strategy as your first property. And that's where people can get it wrong as well, because if they have just a certain amount of money to invest in property and they can't afford the homes or whatever that they see around them, they might go, oh, we'll get an apartment. And if that's not actually going to increase in value, then it's going to be difficult for them to continue to grow their portfolio.
It's really interesting how demographics have changed over the years. I think, 40, 50 years ago, renters were people who maybe were considered dull bludgers, who weren't interested in getting involved in life and getting a job and things like that. And things have changed dramatically according to that. And I think cultural values, like you're saying, have a big impact as well. Looking at the Great Australian Property Mismatch, which is something that comes up often in discussions. Back in 1888, according to some data I've got here, families are shrinking. In a house that was small, 35 metres square, you'd have approximately 6 people or 5 people living in it. And as time's gone by, the number of people living in the houses has decreased, but the houses have grown bigger. So how does that compare to prices these days, Susan, according to you?
Our houses actually haven't grown bigger. So if you have a look at, they have in some areas, you're right, you see these mansions, in some of the more wealthy suburbs in the capital cities. But if you look at the growth areas, the land size areas are decreasing enormously, right? Enormously. And even in the last few years, I've seen land sizes decrease from, say, an average in these growth areas of, say, around 600 square metres to around 300, and even lower, even like 180 square metres for a parcel of land to build a house on, which is just amazing. But this is, a lot of people have this assumption that it is due to, greedy developers chopping up the land, but it's actually not. This is a government directive coming from councils that are trying to help with affordability, actually, and to have the same amount of services divided up by more people paying, so it's not as expensive for people to live. So it's very interesting to see that. I have a client actually who's a dentist, and all he wants is the biggest blocks of land. Doesn't really care where they are, just wants like 1,000 square meters of land, and I can still get those, and some of those are still in very good areas, but they are a rarity, that's for sure. And actually, I was on one the other day that's 1,125 square meters, and it's a really large house that we're building on it. But God, it's so big, it's just like, it's got like sides, it's got a big front yard, a massive backyard, but it's got side yards as well. And it's like, well, we kind of had that growing up, not quite that much, we're sort of more suburban, but so actually the land value, the land sizes, the property sizes are decreasing. One of the things that we insist upon in our Cala inclusions that I mentioned before is with the bedroom sizes. So I just presented a property yesterday for a client for a property in Brisbane, and the room sizes were like 2.8 by 2.9 square meters. And I'm like, no. That's just ridiculous. Like, they need to be over three meters, you know, on each side. So just little, I mean, that's still a very small room, but it makes sense for children. And obviously the master bedroom's bigger than that. But yeah, when I look at 4-bedroom properties that have, like we've had one recently that was a 4-bedroom property with a lounge, dining, kitchen, and another living area. But it was only 185 square meters. And I'm like, why don't we just get rid of one of those rooms? Because do we really need 4 bedrooms anymore, as well as a secondary living area, right? I don't think so. You know, let's get rid of one of the bedrooms and make all of the rooms a bit bigger. So that's also one of the values of, I mean, other than the obvious tax advantages of building new property, is because, you know, I've been doing this for a long time and I know what I'm doing, we're able to influence the design and the layout of the properties right from the get-go. And that's really, these are things that, you know, most people, investors in particular, wouldn't even think about. So, you know, having the right team that knows how to have those conversations, and, you know, have builders that want to work with us, that value the relationship, is really vital for our investors as well.
That's really, really interesting what you're saying about the land getting smaller, because I think, yeah, exactly what you're saying. People don't really need the 4x2 anymore with the 2 living areas. Things have changed quite dramatically. And what are they going to do with all that land that we used to have? What, have a winery or beehives or something?
Well, you know, it's interesting too. One of the things you were saying before about, you know, people having to think more about interest rates. We do start to see policies change around that too. So one side of the coin is the smaller blocks of land, but the other side is what we've seen in New South Wales recently is, you know, granny flats getting approved, not needing council approvals, just needing building approvals. And like, if the builder approves it, the council will sign it. So not having to go through that same laborious building approval process. And that has allowed people to have another stream of income to come in from their principal place of residence, especially when they do live on really large blocks of land. So, you know, we're finding ways around this because, you know, if we're going to achieve 1 million new properties, there have got to be other ways of doing it than all just house and land lots, right? There will be a lot of that, and I think there'll be a lot of that all over Australia. Certainly, well, you know, I was even talking to someone the other day about the Sunshine Coast. I mean, surely at some point the government's going to have to relinquish some of that conservation zoned land to allow for building, because, you know, we kind of need it. But, you know, then we've also got koalas we want to protect. So, you know, and that southeast Queensland corridor is enormously important for koala families. So those habitats are really important. So it's a very tricky balance, I think, is trying to get it right between preserving our natural beauty and all the reasons we love about being Australian, and why so many foreigners invest in Australia, you know, Americans and Europeans and Asians coming to Australia. You know, it's such a great place to invest, but we don't want to destroy that at the same time.
Yeah, I think one of the great things Australia's planning people have done is kept a lot of the trees in the suburbs and in the developments, which is great. Thanks,
Yeah.
Susan. Thanks so much for joining us and sharing all your knowledge with us in that hour of power there. Hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Yeppoon. Are you there for much longer?
No, I'm going home next week, which is brilliant. I can't wait. I've been here for much longer than I expected, and I'm really missing my family and my little dog. But no, I can't wait to get back to Sydney, although I have enjoyed, you know, I'm not wearing 5 layers, you know. I've enjoyed being a bit warmer, although we've had a cold snap up here as well. It was 10 degrees the other day. So anyway, I'm looking forward to going home.
Yes, definitely feeling the cold. Well, thanks so much and have a great day. And for anyone watching, thanks for joining us. And please remember, this was not financial advice in any way. It was just a discussion where Susan from Callum Property was imparting some of her knowledge from dealing in the property market every day. Thanks, Susan. Talk soon.
Thanks, Sage.